Today I'm going to speak about three paradoxes that we find in the first chapter of the epistle to Philippians and verses 12 to 18. Now, paradox is a seemingly absurd or contradictory statement which, when investigated, may prove to be well-founded or true. Here's the passage that I'm taking that from. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Here is this epistle to the Philippians, written by Paul from prison in Rome. And the people he's writing to, they have a number of questions for him and anxieties about him. So first of all, we'll look at imprisoned yet encouraged. And we see that in the opening few verses. Paul, imprisoned in Rome, and he's been visited by Epaphroditus, who was the pastor of the church in Philippi. And Paul knows that the church is upset at the shame of his being in prison and the hindrance to the gospel. So although he's there, he encourages them by explaining how the Lord overrules. He explains that the guards and others in the palace have now heard the gospel. And Paul has time to write to the churches. It reminds us of incidents in church history. Many of you will know that Martin Luther, after he had nailed the theses to the door in Wittenberg, he was a wanted man, and a nobleman on his side for his own protection incarcerated him in a castle. And while he was there, unable to preach, and you would say, what a setback from the gospel. And yet it was there that he translated the Bible into German and did other writings and had much time to think. And then the famous John Bunyan, he was a great preacher, and he used to itinerate and preach in various places. But it was at a time when to be a dissenter was against the law, and he was imprisoned. And we'd say, what a setback, this godly man preaching the gospel. And yet while he was in prison for many years, he wrote Pilgrim's Progress, a book that has been used to help so many coming to faith and Christians to be encouraged. We see again, imprisoned and yet encouraged and able to work for the Lord. More recently, the famous 20th century preacher Martin Lloyd-Jones had a very influential ministry in Westminster Chapel in London. And then he was struck down with cancer. And when he had recovered a little from that, he announced that he was resigning from the pastorate. Again, many people alarmed and concerned, and yet he lived for a number of years after that. And it was then that he had time to be able to edit the sermons that he'd preached. And the great series on Romans and others came out, which were so beneficial for the church. Again, an apparent setback, and yet an advance for the cause of God. Going back to Paul, he was in prison, and yet he was facing this difficulty with great resolution. And he was clearly an inspiration to other believers in Rome. And people that had been somewhat timid before now took courage in both hands and started to preach, knowing that Paul wasn't able to, and it was their responsibility to fill the gap. And he was greatly encouraged by that. And what about ourselves? Do we trust that God is in control of our lives? He can use you wherever you are to his glory, and he can even bring good out of bad situations. Well, a second paradox: opposed and yet content. The church in Philippi was angry when they heard that some jealous believers were glad that Paul was in prison. And some were preaching the gospel, but out of the wrong motives, because they thought it might actually harm him. They were obviously jealous of him. Paul is not naive, but he looks beyond hurt feelings. He looks at the big picture, the spread of the gospel. What grace he was given, and what a triumph to see things in that way. I wonder about ourselves. Can we rise above a preoccupation with self? Can we turn the other cheek and forgive? Can we rejoice even in pain and disappointment? Some listening to this may have heard of Joni Eareckson Tada, and she was broadcasting in to South Wales recently. What a remarkable testimony of this woman, who was struck down at 17, paralysed from the neck downwards, and yet, even in pain, able to experience joy and encourage other Christians. What an inspiration. Lastly, Satan at work, yet God triumphing. Paul is in prison, and so many things seem to be against him. Undoubtedly, Satan is doing his worst. Is Paul downcast, resentful, or bitter? No, he's rejoicing. Why? Because God is triumphing. What a lovely attitude and witness. Can we be like that? Well, think about Jesus. All hell was against him. The cross looked like defeat and utter shame. And yet we know that that was a place of victory. It was there on the cross that Satan was defeated. Sin was dealt with, and death was conquered. The resurrection proves that. Let me ask you, are you trusting Christ for salvation? Have you repented and believed? And Christian, are you trusting Christ day by day? God bless you.